Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time.
Last of all, the Pope fell sick. It soon became apparent that this sickness was unto death, and though but newly returned from a wedding, Clement had to set about the melancholy task of preparing the ring and robe which are used at the funeral of a pope. Having created 30 cardinals, says Platina, and set his house in order, he died the 25th of September, 1543, between the 18th and 19th hour, having lived 66 years and 3 months. And held the papacy for 10 years, 10 months, and 7 days. He was buried, adds the historian, in St. Peter's, but in the pontificate of Paul III, his successor, his body was transferred, along with the remains of Leo X, to the Church of Minerva, and laid in a tomb of marble. Sorrow and secret anguish, says Sariano, brought him to the grave. Ranke pronounces him, without doubt, the most ill-fated pope that ever sat in the papal chair. Clement now reposed in marble in the Minerva, but the evil he had done was not interred with his bones, but his niece lived after him, and to her for a moment we turn. There are beings whose presence seems to darken the light, and taint the very soil on which they tread. Of the number of these was Catherine de' Medici. She was sunny as her own Italy, but there lurked a curse beneath her gaieties and smiles. Wherever she had passed, there was a blight. Around her all that was fair and virtuous and manly, as if smitten by some mysterious and deadly influence, began to pine and die. And moreover, it is instructive to mark how nearly contemporaneous were the departure of Calvin from France and the entrance into that country of Catherine de' Medici. Scarcely had the gates of Paris shut out the reformer when they were open to admit the crafty Italian woman. He who would have been the restorer and savior of his country was chased from it, while she who was to inoculate it with vice, which first corrupted and at last sank it into ruin, was welcomed to it with demonstrations of unbounded joy. We trace a marked change in the destinies of France from the day that Catherine entered it. Up to this time, events seemed to favor the progress of Protestantism in that country, but the admission of this woman was the virtual banishment of the Reformation, for how could it ever mount the throne with Catherine de' Medici sitting upon its steps? And unless the throne were won, there was hardly a hope, in a country where the government was so powerful, of the triumph of the Reformation in the conversion of the great body of the nation. True, the marriage of the king's second son with this orphan of the house of Medici did not seem an event of the first consequence. Had it been the Dauphin whom she espoused, she would have been on the fair way to the throne, but as the wife of Henry, the likelihood was that she would never be more than the Duchess of Orleans, nor had Catherine yet given unmistakable indication of the imperious passion, inclining and fitting her for rule, that were lodged in her. No one could have foretold at that hour that the girl of 15, all radiant with smiles, would become the woman of 50, dripping all over with blood. But from the day that she put her hand into Henry's, all things wrought for her. Even death, as de Bigny has strikingly observed, seemed to be in covenant with this woman. To others, the king of terrors. To Catherine de Medici, he was but the obsequious attendant who waited only till she should signify her pleasure, that he might strike whomever she wished to have taken out of her path. How many a visit, during her long occupancy, did the grim messenger pay to the Louvre! But not a visit did he make which did not assist her in her ascent to power. He came a first time, and lo, the Dauphin lay a corpse, and Henry, Catherine's husband, became the immediate heir to the throne. He came a second time, and now Francis I breathes his last. Henry reigns in his father's stead, and by his side sits the Florentine girl, now Queen of France. Death came a third time to the Louvre, and now it's Henry too that is struck down, but the blow, so far from diminishing, enlarging the power of Catherine. For from this time she became, with a few brief and exceptional intervals, the real ruler of France. Her imbecile progeny sat upon the throne, but the astute mother governed the country. Death came a fourth time to the palace, and now it is the weak-minded Francis too who is carried out a corpse, leaving his throne to his yet weaker-minded brother, Charles IX. If her son, a mere puppet, wore the crown, Catherine, with easy superiority, directed the government, casting off the Guises, with whom till now she had been compelled to divide the power. She stood up alone, the ruler of the land. Even when death shifted the scenes for the last time by the demise of Charles IX, it was not to abridge this woman's influence. Under Henry III, as under all her other sons, it was the figure of Catherine de Medici that was by far the most conspicuous and terrible in France, possessing one of the rare minds which reach maturity at an age when those of others begin to decay. It was only now, during the reign of her last two sons, that she showed all that was in her. She discovered at this period her career a shrewder penetration, a greater fertility of resource, and a higher genius for governing men than she had yet exhibited, and accordingly it was now that she adventured on her boldest schemes of policy, and that she perpetrated the greatest of her crimes. But, notwithstanding all her talent and wickedness, she gained no real success. The cause she espoused did not triumph eventually, and that which she opposed she was not able to crush. Chapter 16. Melanchthon's plan for uniting Wittenberg and Rome. The labor is scattered. The cause advances. The dread it inspires. Calvin and Catherine, a contrast. The keys and the fleur-de-lis. The doublings of Francis. Agreement between Francis and Philip of Hesse at Bar-le-Duc. Campaign. Wittenberg restored to Christopher. Francis I's project for uniting Lutheranism with Romanism. Du Bellai's negotiations with Bucer. Melanchthon sketches a basis of union. Bucer and Hideo add their opinions. The messenger returns with the paper to Paris. Sensation. Council at the Louvre. Plan discussed. An evangelical pope. Of the evangelists who, but a dozen years before the period at which we are now arrived, had proclaimed the truth in France, hardly one now survived, or is laboring in that country. Some, like Lefebvre, had gone to the grave by the way of all men. Others, like Burkin and Pavane, had passed to it by the cruel road of the stake. Some there were, like Farel, who had been chased to foreign lands, there to diffuse the light which France was showing itself unworthy. Others, whose lot was unhappier still, had apostatized from the gospel, seduced by love of the world, or repelled by the terrors of the stake. But if the earlier and lesser lights had nearly all disappeared, their place was occupied by a greater, and despite the swords that were being unsheathed and the stakes that were being planted, it was becoming evident to all men that the sun of truth was mounting into the horizon, and soon the whole firmament would be filled with his light. The movement caused much chagrin and torment to the great ones of the earth. They trembled before a power which had neither war horse nor battle axe, but against which all their force could avail nothing. They saw that mysterious power advancing from victory to victory. They beheld it scattering the armies that stood up to oppose it, and recruiting its adherents faster than the fire could consume them. And they could hardly help seeing in this direction a day when that power would possess the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven. This power was none other than the Christianity of the first ages, smitten by the sword of the pagan emperors, wounded in yet more deadly fashion by the superstition of Rome, but now risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works did show forth themselves in it. The two chiefs of this great drama, which was now opening in France, had just stepped upon the stage, Calvin and Catherine de' Medici. Then one was taken from an obscure town in the north of France. The other came from a city already glorified by the renown of its men of letters and the state and power of its princes. The former was the grandson of a cooper. The later was of the lineage of the princely house of Tuscany. Catherine was placed in the Louvre, with the resources of a kingdom at her command. Calvin was removed outside of France altogether, where in a small town hidden among the hills of the Swiss, he might stand and fight his great battle. But as yet Catherine had not reached the throne, nor was Calvin at Geneva. Death had to open the way that the first might ascend to power, and years of wandering and peril had yet to be gone through before the latter should enter the friendly gates of the capital of the Genevese. We turn for a moment to Marseille. Catherine de' Medici had placed her cold hand in that of Henry of Valois, and by the act a new link had been forged which was to bind together, more firmly than ever, the two countries of Italy and France. The keys and the fleur-de-lis were united for better or for worse. The rejoicings and festivities were now at an end. The crowd of princes and courtiers, of prelates and monks, of liveried attendants and men-at-arms, which for weeks had crowded the streets of Marseille and kept it night and day in a stir, had dispersed, and Francis and Clement, mutually satisfied, were on their way back, each to his own land. The wind slept. The uneasy Gulf of Lyons was still until the pontiff's galley had passed, and as he sailed away over that glassy sea, Clement felt that now the tiara sat firmer on his head than before, and that he might reckon on happier days at the Vatican. Alas, how little could he forecast the actual future! What awaited him at Rome was a shroud and a grave. Francis I, equally overjoyed, but equally mistaken, amused himself on his journey to Paris with visions of the future, arrayed in colors of equal brilliancy. He had not patience till he should arrive at the Louvre before making a beginning with these grand projects. He halted at Avignon, that old city on the banks of the Rhone, which had so often opened its gates to receive popes when Rome had cast them out. Here he assembled his council, and startled its members by breaking to them his purpose of forming a league with the Protestants of Germany. Fresh from the embraces of Clement, this was the last thing his courtiers had expected to hear from their master. Yet Francis I was in earnest. One hand he had given to Rome, the other would he give to the Reformation. He would be on both sides at once. This was very characteristic of this monarch, divided in heart, unstable in all his ways, continually oscillating, but sure to settle on the wrong side in the end, and to reap, as the fruit of all his doublings, only disgrace to himself and destruction to his kingdom. The King of France was, in sooth, at this moment playing a double game, a political league and a religious reform. Of the two projects, the last was the more chimerical, for Francis aimed at nothing less than to unite Rome and the Reformation. What a strange moment to inaugurate these schemes, when Europe was still ringing with the echo of the bull in which the German heretics had been cursed, and which had been issued by the man with whom Francis had been closeted these many days past, and not less strange on the spot chosen for the concoction of these projects, a city which was a second Rome, the very dust of which was redolent with the footprints of the popes, and whose streets and palaces recalled the memories of the pride, the luxury, and the disorders of the papal court. The key of the policy of Francis was his desire to humble his dread rival, Francis V, hence his approach to the Pope on the one hand, and to the Protestant princes on the other. For the papacy he did not greatly care. For Lutheranism he cared still less. His own ascendancy was the object he sought. The political project came first and sped best. An excellent opportunity for broaching it presented itself just at this time. Charles V had carried away by force of arms the young Duke of Wittenberg, and not only had he stolen the Duke, he had stolen his duchy too, and annexed it to the dominions of the House of Austria. Francis thought that to strike for the young Duke, despoiled of his ancestral dominions, would be dealing a blow at Charles V, while he would appear to be doing only a chivalrous act. It would, moreover, vastly please the German princes, and smooth his approaches to them. If his recent doings at Marseilles had rendered him an object of suspicion, his espousal of the quarrel of the Duke of Wurtemberg would be a counterstroke which would put him all right with the princes. An incident which had just fallen out was in the line of this reasoning, and helped to decide Francis. The young Duke Christopher had managed to escape from the Emperor in a way which we have narrated in its proper place. He remained for some time in hiding, and was believed to be dead, but in November 1532 he issued a manifesto claiming restoration of his ancestral dominions. The claim was joyfully responded to by the Protestants of Germany, as well as by his own subjects of Wurtemberg. This was the opening which now presented itself to the King of France, ever ready to ride post from Rome to Germany and back again, with even greater speed and heartier goodwill from Germany to Rome. A diet was assembling at Augsburg to discuss the question of the restoration of the states of Wurtemberg to their rightful sovereign. The representatives of Ferdinand were to appear before the diet to uphold the cause of Austria. Francis I sent Du Bellay as his ambassador with instructions, quietly yet decidedly, to throw the influence of France into the opposite scale. Du Bellay zealously carried out the instructions of his master. He pleaded the cause of Duke Christopher so powerfully before the Diet that it decided in favor of his restoration to Wurtemberg. But the ambassadors of Austria stood firm. If Wurtemberg was to be left from their master and carried over to the Protestant side, it must be by force of arms. Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, met Francis I at Bar-le-Duc, near the western frontier of Germany, and there arranged the terms for a campaign on behalf of the young Duke Christopher. The Landgrave was to supply the soldiers, and the King of France was to furnish, though secretly, for he did not wish his hand to be seen, the requisite money. All three had different aim, though uniting in common action. Philip of Hesse hoped to strengthen Protestantism by enlarging its territorial area. Du Bellay hoped to make the coming war the wedge that was to separate Francis from the Pope, and rend the ultramontane yoke from the neck of his country. Francis was simply pursuing what had been his one policy since the Battle of Pavia, the humiliation of Charles V, which he hoped to effect, in this case, by kindling a war between the German princes and the emperor. There was another party having interests. This party now stepped upon the scene. Luther and Melanchthon were the representatives of Protestantism as a religion, as the princes were the representatives of it as a policy. To make war for the gospel was to them the object of their utmost alarm and abhorrence. They exerted all their rhetoric to dissuade the Protestant princes from drawing the sword, but it was in vain. The war was precipitately entered upon by Philip. A battle was fought. The German Protestants were victorious. The Austrian army was beaten, and Wittenberg, restored to Duke Christopher, was transferred to the political side of Protestantism. The political project of Francis I had prospered. He had wrested Wittenberg from Ferdinand, and through the sides of Austria had hurt the pride of his rival Charles V. This success tempted him to try his hand at the second project, the religious one. To mold opinions might not be so easy as to move armies, but the Lutheran fit was upon Francis just now, and he would try. The Reformation, which the French king mediated, consisted only of a few changes on the surface. These he thought would bring back the Protestants and heal the broken unity of Rome. He by no means wished to injure the Pope, much less to establish a religion that would necessitate a reform of his own life or that of his courtiers. The first step was to sound Melanchthon and Bucer and Hedio as to the amount of change that would satisfy them. It was significant that Luther was not approached. It was Lutheranism, with Luther left out, that was entering into the negotiations with Rome. It does not seem to have struck those who were active in setting this affair on foot that the man who had created the first Lutheranism could create the second, provided the first fell back into the old gulf of Romanism. Meanwhile, however, the project gave promise of prospering. Du Bellay, on his way back from Augsburg, had an interview with Bucer at Strasbourg and, with true diplomatic tact, hinted to the passive theologian that really it was not worth his while to labor at uniting the Zwinglians and the Lutherans. Here was something more worthy of him, a reconcilement of Protestantism and Romanism. The moment this great affair was mentioned to Bucer, other unions seemed little in his eyes. Though he should reconcile Luther and Zwingli, the great rent would still remain. But Rome and the Reformation reconciled, all would be healed, and the source closed of innumerable strifes and wars in Christendom. Bucer, being one of those who had more faith in the potency of persons than of principles, was overjoyed. If so powerful a monarch of France and so able a statesman as Du Bellay had put their shoulders to this work, it must needs, he thought, progress. A special messenger was dispatched to Melanchthon, July 1534, touching this affair. The deputy found the great doctor bowed to the earth under an apprehension of the evils gathering over Christendom. There, first of all, was the division of the Protestant camp, and there, too, was the cloud of war gathering over Europe, and every hour growing bigger and blacker. The project looked to Melanchthon like a reprieve with a world doomed to dissolution. The man from whom it came had been in recent and confidential intercourse with the Pope, and who could tell but that Clement VII was expressing his wishes and hopes to the King of France. Even if it were not so, were there not here the grand monarchs, the King of France and England, on the side of union? Melanchthon took his pen, sat down, and sketched the basis of the one Catholic Church of the future. In this labor he strove to be loyal to his convictions of truth. His plan, in brief, was to leave untouched the hierarchy of Rome, to preserve all her ceremonies of worship, and to reform her errors of doctrine. This, he admitted, was not all that could be wished, but it was a beginning, and more would follow. Finishing the paper, he gave it to a messenger and set off with it to Francis. On his way to Paris, the courier halted at Strasbourg and requested Bucer also to put to paper what he thought ought to form a basis of the union between the two churches. Bucer's plan agreed in the main with that of Melanchthon. The truth was the essential thing. Let us restore it the foundation, and we shall soon see it refashioning the superstructure. So said Bucer. There was another reformer of name in Strasbourg, Idio, a meek but firm man. Him also the messenger of Francis requested to give his master his views in writing. Idio complied, and with these 3 documents the messenger resumed his journey to Paris. On his arrival in the capital, the papers were instantly laid before the king. There was no small sensation in Paris. A great event was about to happen. Protestantism had spoken its last word. Its ultimatum lay on the king's table. How anxiously was the opening of these important papers, which were to disclose the complexion of the future, waited for. Were Rome and Wittenberg about to join hands? Was a new church, neither Romanist nor Protestant, but Reformed and eclectic, about to gather once more within the bosom of all the peoples of Christendom, hushing angry controversies and obliterating the lines of contending sects in one happy concord? Or was the division between the two churches to be henceforward wider than ever, and were the disputes that could not be adjusted in the conference hall to be carried to the bloody field and the blazing stake? Such were the questions that men asked themselves with reference to the 3 documents which the royal messenger had brought back with him from Germany. In the midst of many fears, hope predominated. The king summoned a council at the Louvre to discuss the program of Melanchthon and his 2 fellow reformers. Gathered round the council table at the palace were men of various professions, ranks, and aims. There sat the Archbishop of Paris and other prelates. There sat Du Bellay and a few statesmen, and there too sat doctors of the Sorbonne and men of letters. Some sincerely wished a reformation of religion. Others, including the king, made the reform simply a stalking horse for the advancement of their own interests. The papers were opened and read. All around the table were pleased and offended by turns. The color came to the king's face when he found the reformers commencing by stating that a true faith in Christ was a main requisite for a union as was now sought to be attained. But when, farther on, the Pope's deposing power was thrown overboard, the monarch was appeased. Prominence was given to the doctrine of the justification of sinners, nor was the council displeased when this was ascribed not to good works, nor to the rights of the priests, but to the righteousness and blood of Christ. For had not the schoolmen used similar language? The question of the sacrament was a crucial one. There is a real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, said the reformers, without defining the nature or manner of that presence. But they added, it is faith, not the priest, that gives communion with Christ in the Lord's Supper. The bishops frowned. They saw at a glance that if the opus operatum were denied, their power was undermined and the church betrayed. On neither side could there be surrender on this point. The king had looked forward with some uneasiness to the question of the church government. He knew that the reformers held the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. This, he thought, was fatal to order. But, replied the reformers, the gospel church is a kingdom of priests, and in a kingdom there must be officers and laws. The function of priesthood is inherent in all, but the exercise of it appertains only to those chosen and appointed thereto. The king was reassured. But now it was the turn of the Protestants at the council board to feel alarm, for Melanchthon and his fellow reformers were willing to go so far on the point of church government as to retain the hierarchy. True, its personnel was to undergo a transformation. All its members, from its head downward, became reformed. The Pope was to be retained, but how greatly changed his former self. He was to hold the primacy of rank, but not the primacy of power, and after this he would hardly account his tiara worth wearing. Here, said the Protestants, is the weak point of the scheme. A reformed pope. What indeed? That indeed will be something new. When Melanchthon put this into his scheme of reform, said they, he must have left the domain of possibilities and strayed into the region of utopia. To these greater reforms, a few minor ones were appended. Prayers to the saints were to be abolished, although their festivals were still to be observed. Priests were to be allowed to marry, but only celibates would be eligible as bishops. The monasteries were to be converted into schools. The cup was to be restored to the laity. Private masses were to be abolished. In confession, it was not to be obligatory to enumerate all sins, and, in fine, a conference of pious men, including laymen, was to meet and frame a constitution for the Church, according to the Word of God. Chapter 17. The plan of Francis I for combining Lutheranism and Romanism. End of conference. Francis I takes the matter into his own hand, concocts a new basis of union, sends copies to Germany, to the Sorbonne and the Vatican. Amazement of the Protestants, alarm of the Sorbonnists. They send a deputation to the king. What they say of Lutheranism. Indignation at the Vatican. These projects of union utterly chimerical. Excuse of the Protestants of the 16th century. Their standpoint different from ours. Storms that have shaken the world, but cleared the air. The conference was now over. The king was not displeased. The Protestants were hopeful, but the bishops were cold. At heart they wished to have done with these negotiations, for their instincts surely told them that if this matter went on, it could have but one ending, and that was the subversion of their church. But the king for the moment was on the side of the reform. He would put himself at its head and guide it to such a goal as would surround his throne with a new glory. He would heal the schism, preserve Catholicism, curb the fanaticism of Luther, punish the hypocrisy of the monks, repress the assumptions of the Pope, and humble the pride of the Emperor. To do all this would be to place himself without a rival in Europe. The King of France now took the matter more than ever into his own hands. Francis now proceeded to sketch out what virtually was a new basis of union for Christendom. He thought doubtless that he knew the spirit of the new times and the influences stirring in the world at large better than did the theologians of Wittenberg and Strasbourg, that a throne was a better point of observation than a closet, and that he could produce something broader and more Catholic than Melanchthon, which would hit the mark. Summoning a commission round him, he sat down, and making the papers of the three theologians the groundwork, retrenching here, enlarging there, and expunging some articles wholly, the king and his counselors produced a new basis of union or fusion, different to some extent from the former. The king, although not aspiring like Henry of England to the repute of a theologian, was doubtless not a little proud of his handiwork. He sent copies of it to Germany, to the Sorbonne, and even to the Pope, requesting these several parties to consider the matter and report their judgment upon it to the king. To the German theologians it caused no small irritation. They recognized in the king's paper little but a caricature of their sentiments. In the Sorbonne, the message of Francis awakened consternation. The doctors saw Lutheranism coming in like a torrent, while the king was holding open the gates of France. We can imagine the amazement and indignation which would follow the reading of the king's paper in the Vatican. Modified, it yet retained the essential ideas of Melanchthon's plan, in that it disowned the saints, denied the opus operatum, and left the papal tiara shorn of nearly all its authority and grandeur. But before the document reached Rome, Clement had passed from the scene of agitation, and was now resting in the quiet grave. This portentous paper from the eldest son of the papacy was reserved to greet his successor, Pope Paul III, on his accession to the papal chair, and give him betimes a taste of the anxieties and vexations inseparable from a seat which fascinates and dazzles all save the man who occupies it. But we return to the Sorbonists. The royal missive had alarmed the doctors beyond measure. They saw France about to commit itself to the same downward road on which England had already entered. This was no time to sit still. They went to the Louvre and held a theological disputation with the king's ministers. Their position was not improved thereby. If argument had failed them, they would try what threats could do. Did not the king know that Lutheranism was the enemy of all law and order? That wherever it came, it cast down dignities and powers and trampled them in the dust? If the altar was overturned, assuredly the throne would not be left standing. They thought that they had found the opening in the king's armor, but Francis had the good sense to look at great facts as seen in contemporaneous history. Had law and order perished in Germany? Nay. Did the Protestants of that country reverence and obey their princes more profoundly than ever? Was anarchy triumphant in England? Francis saw no one warring with kings and undermining their authority to save the Pope, who had deposed his brother of England, and was not likely to do the same office for himself one of these days. Sorbonne saw that neither was this the right track. Must France then be lost to the papacy? There did seem at the moment some likelihood of such a disaster, as they accounted it taking place. The year 1534 was drawing to a close, with Francis still holding by his purpose, when an unhappy incident occurred, all unexpectedly, which fatally changed the king's course and turned him from the road on which he seemed about to enter. Of that event, with all the tragic consequences that followed it, we shall have occasion afterwards to speak. As regards this union, or rather fusion, there is no need to express any sorrow over its failure, and to regret that so fair an opportunity of banishing the iron age of controversy and war, and bringing in the golden age of concord and peace, should have been lost. Had this compromise been accomplished, it would certainly have repressed, for a decade or two, the more flagrant of the abuses and scandals and tyrannies of the papacy, but it would also have stifled, perhaps extinguished, those mighty renovating forces which had begun to act with such marked and beneficial effect. Christendom would have lost infinitely more than all it could have gained. It would have gained a brief respite. It would have lost a real and permanent reformation. What was the plan projected? The Reformation was to bring its doctrine, and Rome was to bring its hierarchy, to form the church of the future. But if the new wine had been poured into the old bottle, would not the bottle have burst? Or if the wine were too diluted to rend the bottle, would it not have speedily become as acrid and poisonous as the old wine? Justification by faith, set in the old glosses, circumscribed by the old definitions, and manipulated by the old hierarchy, would a second time, and at no distant date, have been transformed into justification by works. And where then would Protestantism have been? But we are not to judge of the men who advocated this scheme by ourselves. They occupied a very different standpoint from ours. We have the lessons of 3 most eventful centuries, which were necessarily hidden and veiled from them, and the utter contrariety of these 2 systems in their originating principles, and in their whole course since their birth, and by consequence the utter utopianism of attempting their reconcilement, could be seen not otherwise than as the progression of events and centuries furnished the gradual but convincing demonstration of it. Besides, the Council of Trent had not yet met. The hard and fast line of distinction between the two churches had not then been drawn. In especial, that double partition wall of anathemas and stakes, which has since been set up between them, did not then exist. Moreover, the circumstances of the reformer at that early hour of the movement were wholly unprecedented. No wonder that their vision was distracted and their judgment at fault. The two systems were as yet but slowly drawing away the one from the other, and beginning to stand apart, and neither has as yet taken up that distinct and separate ground which presents them to us clearly and sharply as systems that in their first principles, in their roots and fibers, are antagonistic, so that the attempt to harmonize them is simply to try to change the nature and essence of things. Besides, it required a far greater than ordinary amount of courage to accept the tremendous responsibility of maintaining Protestantism. The bravery that would have sufficed for 10 heroes of the ordinary type would scarcely have made at that hour one courageous Protestant. It began now to be seen that the movement, if it was to go forward, would entail on all parties, on those who opposed as well as on those who aided it, tremendous sacrifices and sufferings. It was this prospect that dismayed Melanchthon. He saw that every hour the spirits of men were becoming more embittered, that the kingdoms were falling apart, that the cruel sword was about to shed the blood of man. In short, that the world was coming to an end. Truly the old world was, and Melanchthon, his eye dimmed for the moment by the smoke and vapor of that which was perishing, could not clearly see the new world that was rising to take its place. To save the world, Melanchthon would have put the Reformation into what would have been its grave. Had Melanchthon had his choice, he would have pronounced for the calm, the mephitic stillness in which Christendom was rotting, rather than the hurricane with its noise and overturnings. Happily for us who live in this age, the great scholar had not the matter in this choice. It was the tempest that came. But if it shook the world by its thunders, and swept it by its hurricanes, it has left behind a purer air, a clearer sky, and a fresher earth.
Stop. Chapter 18. First Disciples of the Gospel in Paris. Calvin now the center of the movement. Shall he enter priest's orders? Hazard of a wrong choice. He walks by faith. Visits Noyon. Renounces all his preferment in the Romish Church. Sells his patrimonial inheritance. Goes to Paris. Meets Servetus. His opinions. Challenges Calvin to a controversy. Servetus does not keep his challenge. State of things at Paris. Beta. More ferocious than ever. The times uncertain. Disciples in Paris. Bartholomew Millen. His deformity. Conversion. Zeal for the gospel. Dubourg the draper. Valeton of Nantes. Lecomte. Giulio Camillo. Pioli the bricklayer. Other disciples. Pantheist. Calvin's forecast. Calvin quits Paris and goes to Strasbourg. We return to Calvin, now and henceforward the true center of the Reformation. Wherever he is, whether in the library of Du Tillet, conversing with the mighty dead, and forging, not improbably, the bolts he was to hurl against Rome in future years, or in the limestone cave on the banks of the rivulet of the Claine, dispensing the Lord's Supper to the first Protestants of Poitiers, as its divine founder had, 15 centuries before, dispensed it to the first disciples of Christianity. There it is that the light of the new day is breaking.
Calvin had come to another, most eventful epoch in his life. The future reformer, again, stood at the parting of the ways. A wrong decision at this movement would have wrecked all his future prospects and changed the whole history of the Reformation. We left Calvin setting out from Poitiers in the end of April 1534, attended by the young Canon du Tillet, whose soul cleaved to the reformer, and who did not discover till 2 years afterwards, when he began to come in sight of the stake, that something stronger than even the most devoted love to Calvin was necessary to enable him to cleave to the gospel which Calvin preached. Calvin would be 25 on the 10th of July. This is the age at which, according to the canons, one who had passed his novitiate in the church must take the full orders of priesthood. Calvin had not yet done so. He had not formally broken with Rome, but now he must take up his position decidedly within or decidedly without the church. At an early age, the initiatory mark of servitude to the Pope had been impressed upon his person. His head had been shorn. The custom, which is a very ancient one, is borrowed from the temples of paganism. The priests of Isis and Serapis, Jerome informs us, officiated in their sanctuaries with shorn crowns, as do the priests of Rome at this day. Calvin must now renew his vow and consummate the obedience to which he was viewed as having pledged himself when the rite of tonsure was performed upon him. He must now throw off the fetter entirely, and be bound yet more tightly, and become the servant of the Pope, most probably forever. His heart had left the Church of Rome, and any subjection he might now promise could only be feigned, not real. Yet there were not wanting friends who counseled him to remain in outward communion with Rome. Is it not? We can imagine these counselors saying to the young curé, "Is it not the reformation of the Church which is your grand aim? Well, here is the way to compass it. Dissemble the change within, remain in outward conformity with the Church, push on from dignity to dignity, from curacy to mitre, from a mitre to the purple, and from the purple to the tiara. What post is it to which your genius may not aspire? And once seated in the papal chair, who or what can hinder you from reforming the Church?" The reasoning was specious, and thousands in Calvin's circumstance have listened to similar persuasion and have been undone. So doubtless reasoned Carafa, who, as a simple priest, was a frequenter of the evangelical reunions in Chiaja at Naples, but who, when he became Paul IV, restored the Inquisition, and kindled, alas, numerous stakes at Rome. Those who, listening to such counsel, have adopted this policy, have either never attained the dignities for which they stifled the convictions of duty, or they found that with loftier position had come stronger entanglements, that honors and gold were even greater hindrances than obscurity and poverty, and that if they had now the power, they had not the heart to set on foot the reformation they once burned to accomplish. Calvin, eschewing the path of expediency and walking by faith, found the right road. He refused to touch the gold or wear the honors of the Church whose creed he no longer believed. "Not one, but 100 benefices would I give up," said he, "rather than make myself the Pope's vassal." Even the hope of one day becoming General Amicio of the Pope's army, and carrying over his whole force to the camp of the enemy in the day of battle, could not tempt him to remain in the papal ranks. He arrived in Noyon in the beginning of May. On May 4th, 1534, in presence of the officials, ecclesiastical and legal, he resigned his chaplaincy of La Gizine, and his curacy of Pont-l'Evêque, and thus he severed the last link that bound him to the papacy, and by the sale of his paternal inheritance, at the same time, he broke the last tie to his birthplace. Calvin, his bonds loosened, was now more the servant of Christ than ever. In the sale of his patrimony he had forgotten his father's house, and he was ready to go anywhere, to the stake should his master order him. He longed to plant the standard of the cross in the capital of the great country, and hard by the gates of a university which for centuries had been a fountain of knowledge. Accordingly, he turned his steps to Paris, where he was about to make a brief but memorable stay, and then leave it, never more to return. It was during this visit to Paris that Calvin met, for the first time, a man whom he was destined to meet a second time, of which second meeting we shall have something to say afterwards. This person who now crossed Calvin's path was Servetus. Michael Servetus was a Spaniard of the same age exactly as Calvin, endowed with a penetrating intellect, highly imaginative genius, and a strongly speculative, soaring above both Romanism and Protestantism. He aimed at substituting a system of his own creation, the cornerstone of which was simply theism. He aimed to stroke at the very heart of Christianity, the doctrine of the Trinity. Confident in his system and not less in his ability, he had for some years been leading the life of a knight-errant, having wandered into Switzerland and some parts of Germany in quest of opposers with whom he might do battle. Having heard of the young doctor of Noyon, he came to Paris and threw down the gage to him. Calvin felt that should he decline the challenge of Servetus, the act would be interpreted into a confession that Protestantism rejected the doctrine of the Trinity, and so was corrupt at the core. It concerned the reformers to show that Protestantism was not a thing that tore up Christianity by the roots under pretense of removing the abuses that had grown up around it. This consideration weighed with Calvin in accepting, as he now did, Servetus's challenge. The day, the hour, the place, a house in the suburb of Saint Antoine, were all agreed upon. Calvin was punctual to the engagement, but Servetus, why was never known, did not appear. We shall not forget, says Bungener, when the time comes, the position into which the Spaniard theologian had just thrust the leaders of the Reformation, and Calvin in particular, by selecting him for his adversary on the question of the Trinity, upon which no variance existed between Romanism and the Reformation. He, in a measure, constituted him the guardian of that doctrine, and rendered him responsible for it before all Christendom. It was this responsibility which 19 years afterwards kindled the pile of Servetus. Be informed, edified, and grow in the faith as your spirit is daily nourished in a biblical worldview, because you love the truth. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOPI. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Always listenable, at work or on the go. FirstAmendmentRadio.net/MOBI. No download or app necessary.